This is our historical reading concerning an introduction to the world of the Crusades. Certain pertinent areas that we will discuss would be Egypt. Familiarize yourself with the Mediterranean Sea, the Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, the Sinai, the Dead Sea, Alexandria, Cairo, the River Nile, Mecca, and Medina. Also, Palestine and southern Lebanon, Damascus, Tyre, Acre, Judea and Palestine, and Lebanon in particular. Also northern Syria, Edessa, Antioch, other places of note. The Near East and the Middle East, the lands of Persia, Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine. And of course, out of Africa, Alexandria and Damietta in Egypt. Also, Western Europe and the Mediterranean. So you have the Mediterranean Sea, and at that time, of course, it was the Byzantine Empire, the Kingdom of the Rus to the north. Of course, the Poland, the German Empire, France, and then you have Portugal and Spain. Portugal, Toledo, important place, Barcelona, and of course Leon and Castile in Spain. And of course we have Rome, and then we have Egypt, and Cyprus, and Iconium, and Tripoli to the east. So, without further ado, 900 years ago, the Christians of Europe waged a series of holy wars or crusades against the Muslim world, battling for dominion of a region sacred to both faiths, the Holy Land. This bloody struggle raged for 2 centuries, reshaping the history of Islam in the West. In the course of these monumental expeditions, hundreds of thousands of crusaders traveled across the face of the known world to conquer and then defend an isolated swathe of territory centered on the hallowed city of Jerusalem. They were led by the likes of Richard the Lionheart, warrior king of England, and the saintly monarch of France, Louis the Ninth, to fight in grueling sieges and fearsome battles, passing through verdant forests and arid deserts, enduring starvation and disease, encountering the fabled emperors of Byzantium, and marching beside forbidding Templar knights. Those who died were thought of as martyrs, while survivors believed that their souls had been scourged of sin by the tempest of combat and trials of pilgrimage. The advent of these crusades stirred Islam to action, reawakening dedication to the cause of jihad. Muslims from Syria, Egypt, and Iraq fought to drive their Christian foes out of the Holy Land, championed by the merciless warlord Zangi and the mighty Saladin, empowered by the rise of Sultan Babyars and his elite Mamluk slave soldiers, sometimes aided by the intrigues of the implacable assassins. Years of conflict inevitably bred greater familiarity, even at times grudging respect and peaceful contact through truce and commerce. But as the decades passed, the fires of conflict burned on, and the wide tide slowly turned in Islam's favor. Through the dream of Christian victory lived on, the Muslim world prevailed, securing lasting possession of Jerusalem and the Near East. This dramatic story has always fired the imagination and fueled the debate, and over the centuries, the Crusades have been subject to startlingly varied interpretations, held up as proof of the folly of religious faith and the base savagery of human nature, or promoted as glorious expressions of Christian chivalry and civilizing colonialism. They have been presented as a dark episode in Europe's history when ravening hordes of greedy Western barbarians launched unprovoked, aggressive, or acquisitive attacks upon the cultured innocents of Islam, or defended as just wars sparked by Muslim aggression and prosecuted to recover Christian territory. The Crusaders themselves have been depicted as both land-hungry brutes and pilgrim soldiers inspired by fervent piety, and their Muslim rivals portrayed as vicious and tyrannical oppressors of holy war or jihad, ardent fanatics or devout paragons of honor and clemency. The medieval Crusades have also been used as a mirror to the modern world, both through the forging of tenuous links between recent events and the distant past, and via the dubious practice of historical parallelism. Thus, during the 19th century, the French and English appropriated the memory of the Crusades to affirm their imperial heritage, while the 20th and 21st centuries have witnessed a deepening tendency within some sections of the Muslim world to equate modern political and religious struggles with holy wars witnessed 9 centuries earlier. This book explores the history of the Crusades from both the Christian and Muslim perspectives, focusing in particular upon the contest for control of the Holy Land, and examines how medieval contemporaries experienced and remembered the Crusades. It draws upon the wonderfully rich mine of available written evidence or primary sources from the Middle Ages, the likes of chronicles, letters, and legal documents, poems, and songs recorded in languages as diverse as Latin, Old French, Arabic, Hebrew, Armenian, Syriac, and Greek. Beyond these texts, a study of material remains from imposing castles to delicate manuscript art and minuscule coins has thrown new light on the crusading era. Throughout, original research has been informed by the great outpouring of modern scholarship in the field witnessed by the last 50 years, containing the history of the Crusades to the Holy Land between 1095 and 1291 in a single accessible volume is a massive challenge, but it does offer enormous opportunities, the chance to trace the grand sweep of events, uncovering the visceral reality of human experience through agony and exaltation, horror and triumph, to chart the shifting fortunes and perceptions of Islam and Christendom. It also makes it possible to ask a series of crucial, interlocking, and overarching questions about these epochal holy wars. Issues linked to the origins and causes of the war for the Holy Land are of fundamental importance. How did two of the world's great religions come to advocate violence in the name of God, convincing their followers that fighting for their faith would open the gates to heaven or paradise? And why did endless thousands of Christians and Muslims answer the call to crusade and jihad, or holy war, knowing full well that they might face intense suffering and even death? It is also imperative to consider whether the First Crusade, launched at the end of the 11th century, was an act of Christian aggression, and what perpetuated the cycle of religious violence in the Near East for the 200 years that followed. The outcomes and impact of these holy wars are equally significant. Wars and was the crusading era a period of unqualified discord, the product of an inevitable clash of civilizations, or one that revealed a capacity for the coexistence and constructive cross-cultural contact between Christendom and Islam? We must also ask who in the end won the war for the Holy Land and why, but more pressing still is the question of how this age of conflict affected history and why these ancient struggles still seem to cast a shadow over the world to this day. Medieval Europe. In the year 1000, the county of Anjou in west-central France was ruled by Fulk Nera from 987 to 1040. A brutal and rapacious warlord, Fulk spent most of his 53 years in power locked in near constant struggle, fighting on every front to retain control of his unruly county, scheming to preserve his independence from the feeble French monarchy, and preying upon his neighbors in search of land and plunder. He was a man accustomed to violence, both on and off the battlefield, capable of burning his wife at the stake for adultery, and of orchestrating the ruthless murder of a royal courtier. But for all the blood on his hands, Fulk was also a committed Christian, one who recognized that his brutish ways were, by the tenets of his faith, inherently sinful, and thus might lead to his eternal damnation. The Count himself admitted in a letter that he had caused a great deal of bloodshed in various battles, and was therefore terrified by the fear of hell. In the hope of purifying his soul, he made 3 pilgrimages to Jerusalem, more than 2,000 miles away. On the last of these journeys, now an old man, Fulk was said to have been led naked to the Holy Sepulchre, the site of Jesus' apparent death and resurrection, with a leash around his neck, being beaten by his servant while he begged Christ for forgiveness. But we might ask on a psychological level, what drove Fulk Nera to make such drastic gestures of repentance, and why was his story filled with such feral turmoil? Even people in the 11th century were shocked by the Count's unbridled sadism and outlandish acts of devotion, so his career evidently was an extreme example of medieval life, but his experiences and mindset were reflective of the forces that shaped the Middle Ages and gave birth to the Crusades. And it would be people like Fulk, who, including many of his own descendants, who stood in the front line of these holy wars. Western Europe in the 11th century. Many of those who lived in the same early 11th century world as Fulk Nera feared that they were witnessing the last dark and desperate days of humanity. Apocalyptic dread reached its height in the early 1030s, when it was thought the millennial anniversary of Jesus' death would presage the Last Judgment. One chronicler wrote of this time, "Those rules which governed the world were replaced by chaos. They knew then that the end of days had arrived." This palpable anxiety alone helps to explain Fulk's penitent mentality. But as far as the Count and his contemporaries were concerned, it had not always been so. They harbored a collective memory of a more peaceful and prosperous past, a golden age when Christian emperors ruled in God's name, bringing order to the world in accordance with his divine will. And of course, that is an example of a theocracy. We have that in both Christian and Islamic texts. And the first two reasons why people were scared, in the year 1033 was because the year 33 was Christ's death and resurrection, and there's a thing in Christian theology about after 1,000 years, after millennium, that Christ would return. So at this point, 1030 would be, approaching the time of Christ's return, and people really believed in it. And regardless, though, the hazily imagined ideal, which is the theocracy we have referred to, was by no means a perfect recollection of Europe's history, but it did encapsulate some shards of truth. Roman imperial rule had provided stability and affluence in the West until the late 4th century CE. Okay? And in the East, the Roman Empire lived on until 1453. Ruled from the great city of Constantinople, founded in the year 324 by Constantine the Great, the first emperor to convert to Christianity. Today, historians refer to this enduring realm as Byzantium. In the West, between the 5th and the 7th centuries, power developed on to a bewildering array of barbarian tribes, but around the year 500, one of these groups, the Franks, established control over northeastern Gaul, giving rise to a kingdom known as Francia, from which the modern nation of France took its name. By 800, a descendant of these Franks, Charlemagne, 768 to 814, had united such a huge swathe of territory encompassing much of modern France, Germany, Italy, and the Low Countries, that he would lay claim to the long-dormant title of Imperator of the West. Charlemagne and his successors, the Carolingians, presided over a short-lived period of renewed security, but their empire crumbled under the weight of succession disputes and repeated invasions by Scandinavian Vikings and Eastern European Magyars. From the 850s onwards, Europe was again ripped apart by political fragmentation, warfare, and unrest. The embattled kings of Germany still sought to claim the imperial title, and a royal house in France survived in a desperately emasculated state. By the 11th century, Constantine and Charlemagne had passed into legend, the embodiments of a distant era. In the course of medieval European history, many a Christian king sought to emulate and imitate their supposed achievements, among them some who would fight in the Crusades. By the time of Falknera, the West was gradually emerging from this post-Carolingian age of decline, despite the predictions of Armageddon. But in terms of political and military power and social and economic organization, most regions were still highly fragmented. Europe was not partitioned into nation-states in the modern sense of the word. Instead, the likes of Germany, Spain, Italy, and France were divided into many smaller polities, ruled over by warrior lords, most of whom were bound by only loose ties of association and loyalty to a crown monarch. Like folk, these men bore titles such as dux and comes, or such as duke and count, that harkened back to a Roman and Carolingian times, and were drawn from the ranks of a nascent military aristocracy, the increasingly dominant class of well-equipped semi-professional fighting men who came to be known as knights. And again, just a brief note on France. And so he did say that and we talked about it in the West between the 5th and the 7th centuries. We see around the year 500, the Franks established control over northeastern Gaul, giving rise to a kingdom known as Francia. All right. And France proved to be a major center of crusade enthusiasm and recruitment when the wars for the Holy Land began in the year 1095. Even so, not all crusaders were French, but contemporaries who wrote about this area, especially those like Muslims who were looking in from the outside Western Europe, tended to brand all Christian participants in these holy wars as Franks, in Arabic, Ifrani. It therefore has become common practice to describe the Crusaders and those Western Europeans who settled in the Near East as the Franks. Now, getting back to where we were talking about, which was the Knights. Well, 11th century Europe was not in a state of fully fledged anarchy, but the ravening violence of feud and vendetta was commonplace and lawlessness endemic. Society was highly localized. Nature's grip over the West had yet to be loosened, with vast swathes of land still blanketed in forest or left open and uncultivated, and most major road systems dated back to Imperial Rome. It was common in such a world to go through life without traveling more than 50 miles from one's birthplace, a fact that made Falknera's repeated journeys to Jerusalem and the latter popularity of crusading in the distant Holy Land all the more extraordinaire. Mass communication also did not exist as it would be understood today, because most people were illiterate and printing had not yet been invented. Nevertheless, in the course of the Central Middle Ages, between 1000 and 1300, Western civilization began to show sure signs of development and expansion. Urbanization slowly gathered pace, and growth in the population of towns and cities helped to stimulate economic recovery and the revival of a monetary-based economy. Among those communities who spearheaded a resurgence in long-distance trade were the seaborne merchants of Italia, based on their cities like the Amalfi Coast, Pisa's coast, Genoa's coast, the coast of Venice, or Venezia. Other groups demonstrated a marked propensity for military conquest. The Normans of northern France, descendants of Viking settlers, were especially energetic in the mid-11th century, colonizing Anglo-Saxon England and seizing southern Italy and Sicily from the Byzantines and North African Arabs. Meanwhile, in Iberia, a number of Christian realms began to push their borders south, reconquering territory from the Muslims of Spain. As Western Europeans began to look Beyond their early medieval horizons, the forces of commerce and conquest brought them into a closer contact with the wider world and with the great civilizations of the Mediterranean. The ancient Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire and the sprawling Arab Islamic world. These long-established superpowers were historic centers of wealth, culture, and military might. As such, they tended to regard the West as little more than a barbarian backwater, the dismal homeland of savage tribesmen who might be fierce fighters, but were essentially just as uncontrollable rabble and thus posed no real threat. The coming of the Crusades would help to overturn this dynamic, even as it confirmed many of these prejudices. And then we have late Christendom. Ancient Roman rule undoubtedly had a profound effect upon all aspects of Western history, but the empire's most important and enduring legacy was the Christianization of Europe. Constantine the Great's decision to embrace Christianity, then a minor Eastern sect, after experiencing a vision in 1312, catapulted this faith onto the world stage. Within less than a century, Christianity had displaced paganism as the empire's official religion, and through the agency of Roman influence, Christ's message spread across Europe, even as the political state that had given its impetus faltered. The Christian faith gained in strength. Europe's new barbarian chieftains converted and soon began to claim that they had a divinely ordained right to rule over their tribes as kings. The mighty unifier Charlemagne styled himself as a sacral or sacred ruler, one who held the right and responsibility to defend and uphold the faith. By the 11th century, Latin Christianity, so called because of the language of its scripture and ritual, had penetrated to almost every corner of the West. The adherents of this Latin branch of Christianity, which today is more commonly known as Roman Catholicism, or more accurately described in a medieval setting as Latins. A central figure in this process was the Pope in Rome. Christian tradition maintained that there were 5 great fathers or patriarchs of the Church spread across the Mediterranean world of Rome: Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. But the Bishop of Rome, who came to call himself Papa, or Father, or Pope, sought to claim preeminence among all these. Throughout the Middle Ages, the papacy struggled not only to assert its ecumenical worldwide rights, but also to wield meaningful authority over the ecclesiastical hierarchy of the Latin West. The decline of the Roman and Carolingian empires disrupted frameworks of power within the Church, just as it had done within the secular sphere. Across Europe, bishops enjoyed centuries of independence and autonomy from papal control, with most prelates owing their first allegiance to local political rulers and the sacral kings of the West. By the early 11th century, popes were straining simply to make their will felt in central Italy, and in the decades that followed, they would sometimes even find themselves exiled from Rome itself. Nonetheless, it would be a Roman pope who launched the Crusades, prompting tens of thousands of Latins, Roman Catholics, to take up arms and fight in the name of Christianity. This remarkable feat in and of itself served to extend and strengthen papal power, but the preaching of these holy wars should not be regarded as purely cynical, self-serving act. The papacy's role as the progenitor of crusading did help to consolidate Roman ecclesiastical authority in regions like France, and to begin with at least, Crusader forces looked as though they might follow the Pope's commands, functioning almost as papal armies. Even so, more altruistic impulses probably were also at work. Many of the medieval popes seemed earnestly to have believed that they had a wider duty to protect Christendom. They also expected upon death to answer to God for the fate of every soul once in their care, by constructing an ideal of Christian holy war in which acts of sanctified violence would actually help to cleanse a warrior soul of the sin. The papacy was opening up a new path to salvation for its Latin flock. In fact, the Crusades were just one expression of a much wider drive to rejuvenate Western Christendom, championed by Rome from the mid-11th century onwards in the so-called Reform movement. As far as the papacy was concerned, any failings within the church were just the symptoms of a deeper malaise, the corrupting influence of the secular world, long enshrined by the links between clergymen and lay rulers, and the only way to break the stranglehold enjoyed by the imperators and kings over the church was for the Pope finally to realize his God-given right to supreme authority. The most vocal and extreme proponent of these views was Pope Gregory VII from 1073 to 1085. Gregory ardently believed that he had been set on earth to transform Christendom by seizing absolute control of Latin ecclesiastical affairs. In pursuit of his ambition, he was willing to embrace almost any available means, even the potential use of violence enacted by papal servants, whom he called soldiers of Christ. Although Pope Gregory VII went too far too fast and ended his pontificate in ignominious exile in southern Italy, his bold strides did much to advance the twin causes of reform and papal empowerment, establishing a platform from which one of his successors and former advisor, Pope Urban II, from 1088 to 1099, could instigate the First Crusade. Urban's call for a holy war found a willing audience across Europe, in large part because of the prevailing religious atmosphere in the Latin world. Across the West, Christianity was an almost universally accepted faith, and in contrast to modern secularized European society, the 11th century was a profoundly spiritual era. This was a setting in which the Christian doctrine impinged upon virtually every facet of human life, from birth and death to sleeping and eating, marriage and health, and the signs of God's omnipotence were clear for all to see, made manifest through acts of miraculous healing, divine revelation, and earthly and ecclesiastical portents. Concepts such as love, charity, obligation, and tradition all helped to shape medieval attitudes to devotion, but perhaps the most powerful conditioning influence was fear, the same fear that made Faulkner believe that his soul was in peril. Religion, indeed, predicated on fear, prejudice, and lies. The same fear that makes one believe that their soul is in peril. The Latin Church of the 11th century taught that every human would face a moment of judgment, the so-called weighing of souls. Purity would bring the everlasting reward of heavenly salvation, but sin would result in damnation and an eternity of hellish torment and torture. For the faithful of the day, the visceral reality of the dangers involved was driven home by graphic images and religious art and sculpture of the punishments to be suffered by those deemed impure, the damned, wretched sinners strangled by demons, the damned herded into the fires of the underworld by hideous devils. Under these circumstances, it was hardly surprising that most medieval Latin Christians were obsessed with sinfulness, contamination, and the impending afterlife, one extreme expression of the pressing desire to pursue an unsullied and perfected Christian life was monasticism, in which monks or nuns made vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, lived in ordered communities, dedicating themselves to God. By the 11th century, one of the most popular forms of monastic life was that advocated by the Burgundian monastery of Cluny in eastern France. The Cluniac movement grew to have some 2,000 dependent houses from England to Italy, enjoyed far-reaching influence, not least in helping to develop and advance the ideals of reform movement. Think about the Cluniac reforms. And of course, its power was reaching to an apex in the 1090s when Pope Urban II, himself a former Cluniac monk, held the papal office. Of course, the demands of monasticism were beyond the means of most medieval Christians, and for ordinary laymen and women, the path to God was strewn with the dangers of transgression, because many seemingly unavoidable aspects of human existence, like pride, hunger, lust, and violence, were deemed sinful. But a number of interconnected salvific remedies were available, even though their theoretical and theological foundations had yet fully to be refined. Latins were encouraged to confess their offenses to a priest, who would then allot them a suitable penance, the performance of which supposedly canceled out the taint of sin. The most common of all penitential acts was prayer, but the giving of alms to the poor or donations to religious houses and the performance of a purgative devotional journey or pilgrimage were also popular. These meritorious deeds might also be undertaken outside the formal framework of penance, either as a sort of spiritual down payment or in order to entreat God or one of his saints for aid. Falconer was operating within this established belief structure or web of beliefs when he sought salvation in the early 11th century. One remedy he pursued was the foundation of a new monastery within his county of Anjou. According to Falk's own testimony, he did this so that monks could be joined together there and pray day and night for the redemption of my soul. This idea of tapping into the spiritual energy produced in monasteries through lay patronage was still at work in the year 1091, when the southern French noble Gaston IV of Béarn decided to donate some property to the Cluniac house of Saint Foy Morlas in Gascony. Gaston was an avowed supporter of the Reformed papacy, had campaigned against the Moors of Iberia in 1087, and would go on to become a crusader. The legal document recording his gift to Saint Foy stated that he acted for the benefit of his own soul, that of his wife and children, and in the hope that God may help us in this world in all our needs, and in the future grant us eternal life. In fact, by Gaston's day, most of Western Christendom's lay nobility enjoyed similar well-established connections with monasteries, and this had a marked effect upon the speed at which crusade enthusiasm spread across Europe after the year 1095. Partly this was because the vow undertaken by knights committing to the holy war mirrored that taken by monks, a similarity that seemed to confirm the efficacy of fighting for God. More important still was the fact that the papacy, with its links to religious houses like Cluny, relied upon the monasteries of the Latin West to help spread and support the call to crusade. The second path of salvation embraced by Falconer was pilgrimage, and given his multiple journeys to Jerusalem, remember he did 3, he evidently found this particular form of penitential devotion especially compelling, later writing that the cleansing force of his experiences left him in high spirits and exultant. Latin pilgrims often traveled to less distant locations, including major centers like Rome and Santiago de Compostela in northeastern Spain, and even local shrines and churches, but the Holy City was fast emerging as the most revered destination. Jerusalem's unrivaled sanctity was also reflected in the common medieval practice of placing the city at the center of maps depicting the world. All of this had a direct bearing upon the exultant reaction to crusade preaching, because the Holy War was presented as a form of armed pilgrimage, one that had Jerusalem as its ultimate objective. In the next video, we'll talk about warfare and violence in Latin Europe. Then we'll cover the Muslim world, the early history of Islam, the fragmentation of the Muslim world, the Near East at the end of the 11th century, Islamic warfare and jihad, Islam and Christian Europe on the eve of the Crusades, and that'll end our introduction, and we still have another concluding summary to go over. Alright, so that's the first part of the World of the Crusades.